Hello, everyone. This is Ana Viana, and I am one of the Brazilian Center for Nazis and Holocaust Study coordinators. I am delighted to welcome you to this interview with a more than special guest, Professor Johann Chapoutot, from whom we've certainly heard us talk about. We're delighted to have Professor Chapoutot here today, not only because we admire his work and quote it like a lot around here, but also because we're celebrating a fresh book release here in Brazil. For the first time, there will be a translation of one of Professor's books in Portuguese, which is a huge reason to be excited, since translations of historiography books about Nazis usually take a long time to reach us, especially when those books are recent. This is a severe problem that directly impacts Brazilian historians' work, since to study the Nazi regime, you must be fluent at least in one or two languages other than Portuguese, such as Spanish, English, or French. Happily, we could access some of the professor's books and learn a lot from them. We have always mentioned them in our content, either on our podcast or on Instagram, but now we will gladly recommend it directly to you. For those of you that, for some mystical reason, do not know him yet, Professor Johann Chapoutot is a renowned French scholar who has made a pioneer work in understanding the Cultural Revolution promoted by the Nazi regime, as well as the uses and the construction of a new historical reality in the Third Reich. Professor Chapoutot currently teaches at the Sorbonne University and has also taught at the Pierre Mendès France University. Some of the professor's works are The Law of the Blood, Thinking and Acting Like a Nazi, Greeks, Romans, Germans, How the Nazis Usurped Europe's Classical Past, Hitler, a biography written in partnership with French historian Christian Ingrao, and our main theme for today's conversation, La Révolution culturelle nazie, or in a free translation to English, the Nazi Cultural Revolution, which has just been translated to Portuguese under the title of A Revolução Cultural Nazista. Without further ado, Professor Chapoutot, thank you so much for accepting our invitation for this interview today. We are thrilled to have you here with us. And first, I would like to ask you to tell a little bit more about your academic trajectory as an introduction to our public here in Brazil. We touched on your published works and some general topics you have worked with, but we'd definitely like to hear it from you.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for this very kind invitation and for the way you prepared this session. As you mentioned in your very nice and very kind introduction, I'm a scholar, a French scholar who happens to work on Germany. I'm holding a chair at the Sorbonne about German history, and my main work till today has dealt with Nazi Germany. So in 3 steps, the first step was the rewriting of history by the Nazis. That was the topic of my PhD, which dealt with the Nazis and the rewriting of antiquity, Greek and Roman antiquity. The second step was for the second PhD, so to say, for the habilitation, the second thesis you have to write to become a full professor here in France or in Germany. It dealt with the National Socialist conception of the norm, of the moral and of the legal norm. So the question of National Socialist normativity, the basic question was how was it possible for human beings to do what they did during the period between 1933 and 1945, and one of the main grounds of that work was that it's not easy to be mean and to kill. Actually, you have to have very good reasons for that, except if you are a psychopath, which well, there were some psychopaths, of course, in the ranks of the Nazis, but the vast majority of them were just normal human beings, and so normal human beings need good reasons to be so to exert such violence. So that was the topic of my second big research book, and the third book was about National Socialism and management, because one of the people I studied in my previous works, Reinhard Höhn, an SS general and a jurist specialized in public law, became, after the Second World War, the leading German specialist on the theory of management. So in a whole, my whole work tries to understand what modernity is and how, alas, a National Socialism could be understood as a question, as an answer to the question asked by modernity in Germany. So that would sum it up a little bit shortly, but I hope I could answer your question.
Certainly. Thank you so much, Professor. Like I said, we're huge admirers here. You're like probably one of the most quoted person in our works and our researches. So we're very happy. And before we go properly to our questions, I think it is important to highlight that we have not read the new translation of Professor Chapoutot's The Nazi Cultural Revolution yet. Therefore, we made the questions that we're asking here based on our previous knowledge of his work and our expectations for this fresh new reading that we're very excited to. So yeah, I guess here we go. Well, to begin, Professor, one of the central aspects that, in our view, runs through your work, at least in the works that, like I said, we had contact with, is the perception that Nazism was not only a rereading of history, but also a kind of life rewriting of it with a very, very specific purpose. So can you tell us a bit more about how you correlate the Nazi regime's necessity of rewriting the past to make this new past the basis of an eschatological future that jumps out of the known lines of history to become something else? How do you interpret the paradox of history's central significance and the desire to finish it? And how do you think it collaborates in the affirmative that history was the main object of the Nazis' worldview?
Thank you very much for this very intelligent and thorough question. The relationship between the Nazis and history in general, I started thinking about that when I realized something which is obvious. In the heart of the 20th century, in the heart of Europe, two regimes, the fascist regime in Italy and the National Socialist regime in Germany, pretended to recreate antiquity. On May the 9th, 1936, in Italy, in Rome, Benito Mussolini proclaimed the rebirth of the Roman Empire, which is strange in a way when you consider the fact that Italy was a very modern nation in the heart of Europe, in the heart of the 20th century. And at the same time, the Nazis were organizing their 1936 Olympics, which they were staging as a proof that the new Germany was the rebirth of the ancient Greece. So that's very striking, actually, this collision between antiquity and the 20th century in two of the most industrially and economically developed nations of Europe. So that fact has been questioned and has been studied as far as Italy, fascist Italy, is concerned. The rewriting of antiquity and the use of the Roman past by the fascist regime is well known. Not so much in Germany, for obvious reasons as well, because in Germany there is no territorial continuity between the antiquity, the antique past, and the present of the country. So I started reflecting on that and finding an ocean of sources, actually, as far as the arts, history as a science, teaching history, the films, etc., and architecture were concerned. And I could see that there is a project that is proposed by the National Socialist regime to its people, which is to come back to the past, to bring about what I call, in the book you mentioned, the book which is translated now into Portuguese in Brazil, which I call the cultural revolution. That is to say, a revolution in the pre-revolutionary sense of the word. Revolution, since the French Revolution has meant the opening of a new future. But before the French Revolution, it meant coming back to the starting point, coming back to the origin. That derives, of course, from the etymology of the word revolution, which is revolvere in Latin, which means to come back, like in a revolver, actually, which spins around itself. So coming back to the past, a past that was best exemplified, the Nazis said, by the antiquity of the Greeks and the Romans, because for them, for the Nazis, Greeks and Romans were not Mediterraneans. They were not from the south. They were coming from the north. That is to say, they were coming from the North Germany or the south of Scandinavia. They had been Germanic tribes immigrating from their original north to colonize to settle down in the south and to colonize the south. The fact is that, of course, the Greek and the Roman civilization disappeared in themselves. Of course, they had heritage, but a heritage, and they had heirs, but they disappeared. And this is something that, of course, is deeply underlined by the Nazis as a warning to the present. If the Greeks and the Romans were so bright and so strong and so prestigious could disappear, of course, we, the present people, can disappear from the surface of the earth. And this is where I come to answering your question. On the one hand, of course, they stress over the importance of history, coming back to the past, recreating a past that was good and that was healthy and that was happy for the Germanic race in Greece and in Rome. And on the other hand, they see, but this is complementary, they see history as a process of degeneration, as a process of attrition, as a process of death, actually. So when you read the Nazis and what they have to say about history and the course of history, you can clearly see that for them, history is a valley of death, a valley of tears, and a valley of death. History is the place or the process where Germanic tribes and the Germanic race becomes increasingly weak, unhappy, and is threatened to disappear. So in that respect, the Nazis proposed to the German people to get out of history, to end history, to put an end to history, to quit and to leave that valley of death and that valley of tears, to project themselves into something else. And that something else would be the 1,000 years Reich, das tausendjährige Reich, the Reich of 1,000 years, which is, of course, a clear reference to an old Christian millenarianism, but which is also a duly elaborated project to create sort of safe zone for the Germanic race. That safe zone would be in the east, a colonial empire where the Germanic race could be free to give birth to children and to feed them, to produce biological substance in the form of children and in the form of crops, for instance, to feed them. So that would be the space, and the time would be actually the very image of that space, a plain sequence where there wouldn't be any history anymore, because there wouldn't be events anymore. There wouldn't be wars anymore, because there wouldn't be an enemy anymore. They would get rid of that enemy one way or another, by deportation or by extermination. That solution evolved in the course of the very few years between 1939 and 1941-42. But the main idea would be that they would put an end to history, and they would ensure the happiness and the life of the Germanic race.
Thank you. That was very enlightening. Actually, I think regarding to this question, history seems to be the basis of this complete revolution that the Nazis were planning, right? So the racial worldview would sweep the earth and create the new Aryan world. But as other French philosophers, Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe and Jean-Luc Nancy point out, the newborn Aryan world would not be simply a world slaved and explored by the Aryans, although it will also definitely be slaved and explored. But it would be more. It would be a world that was made Aryan. So in this sense, a new understanding of history was also the foundation of this new world. And having this in mind, and after reading a little bit about the Nazi Cultural Revolution, it seems that culture was a central concept for the Nazis when they were rewriting the past to build this future. So could you tell us more about what the Nazis saw as culture and its place in this revolution?
Yes, of course. Thank you for that question. I would like to come back to the topic of the world, as you mentioned it, because contrary to what we tend to read in most of the books that do not really know what National Socialism was, the Nazis didn't want to conquer the world. They were not interested in the world. Eventually, they would be interested, but in a very, very remote future. But actually, their main goal was to create a colonial empire on the very ground of Europe. They were not very much interested in the ancient German colonies in Africa, for instance, for a simple reason. They were biological determinists, and they feared the consequence of too much sun, for instance, on the German organism, on the German body. So they wanted to stay on the firm ground of Europe, and they wanted to proceed east. They had some problems to solve with the West, with England and with France, Belgium, and Holland, but their main the main objective was the East, which was for them a vast ground to colonize, as was or as had been Africa and Asia for the British and for the French. So they were not interested by the world, quite on the contrary. They were interested by a geographical zone that stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Ural in the Soviet Union, and from the North Sea to Crimea. So that was it. That's one thing. And you asked a question about culture and their conception of culture. This is something very important because it helps us understand why very intelligent people and people like you and me, actually, who were well-read, who had degrees, and who were professors at universities, could become fierce Nazis. That lies in their conception or misconception of culture. They had a very classical conception of culture, which was very widespread in Europe and in the New World in those days. Culture being, in their eyes, something that is produced by a biological organism and by it only. That's why they could say that jazz music, for instance, was a music produced by Black bodies that could not be understood but by Black people. So an Aryan, a German, a Nordic Germanic man could not listen to jazz music because it was not his biology. That's why they considered that there is a degenerate art, an art that is produced by sick people who are themselves degenerate. Somebody who sees a horse blue or green is by definition sick because he has a cognitive or a perception problem. So everything that is made by the hand of a human being or a para-human being in their eyes was reserved to the perception of his kind, of his race. That has many consequences that are problematic, actually, because if everything that was created by a specific race is reserved to that race, then morality or the law are reserved to a particular race. And this is very powerful. In the book you mentioned the law of blood. I showed that, for instance, when they went east in 1941, they clearly said to the soldiers and to the policemen and to the civil servants, our laws, our norms do concern our race and nothing else and nobody else. Our norms, our laws do not apply to the Russians or to the Slavs in general, or of course to the Jews. They are a different kind of biological substance, a different kind of species, and they have their own laws, their own norms. So you're free to shoot and you're free to go, because again, you have to be kind to a child when the child is from Germanic ascent, but on the contrary, you have to be fierce and you have to kill a Jewish child, because a Jewish child is not a child, is a little Jew who is growing. So you see, we deal here with a particularistic conception of culture as opposed to a universalistic one. We, you and me, children of the 21st century, we do have a universalistic conception of culture, as opposed to the Nazis or the fascists, for instance. We tend to consider that we can listen to jazz music or to Johann Sebastian Bach, even if we're not Black or not white or whatever. We tend to consider that 1 + 1 is 2, regardless of our background, of our ethnicity, etc. That was not the case for the Nazis, and that was not the case either for the elites of Europe and of Northern America in the 1930s. The Nazis were not extremely innovative in that way. Their conception of culture was quite mainstream in those days. They only drew the most terrible consequences from that particularistic conception of culture. And that those consequences were that there is no humanity, there is no human species, and as a consequence, the norms that apply to me as a Germanic being do not apply to you or to somebody else when you or somebody else is from a different race.
Yes, I would like just to mention that it's very it was very enlightening when we were reading, me and Anna, especially reading your book, this methodological point of view that we have to take the Nazis seriously, in a sense that we have to really try to understand what they were proposing and what they were thinking, and not disregarding as just like, oh, they're crazy people and they're just talking nonsense. Because as you point out in your work, there is a sense in what they're saying. They are coherent in their ideology and the way they're thinking. So that's just something that I wanted to mention because I didn't mention before. But going to the other question.
If you allow me, just
of course.
a remark on your comment. Thank you for that methodological comment. It's true, and you're right. We have a tendency to, of course, to reject what those people said and wrote, because it's nonsense for us. It's absolutely preposterous, and it doesn't make any sense. The problem is that those people acted, and they wrote, and they talked, and that their actions, their writings, and their words were coherent with each other, and that their words and their thoughts gave a meaning to actions that do not have any meaning for us. The same goes for today. I mean, constantly on a daily basis, as citizens of Brazil under a strange president, or as citizens of France under another strange president, or of the US under Trump, we are confronted every day with absurd things, absurd and revolting, of course, that makes us angry. Of course, we are tempted to consider that those people are crazy. But the problem is that those words and those ideas give meaning to massive actions that have consequences for Brazil, for the United States, for France, for Europe, and for the world. And in order to be stronger in front of them, and to be able to fight them, and hopefully to defeat them, fingers crossed for the presidential election to come in Brazil, by the way, in order for us to do all that, we have to understand that they are deadly serious. And I mean deadly serious, because they bring about death everywhere. Death of the world by the destruction of Amazonia, for instance, and a death of society and of the weak. So we have to accept that those are human beings who have themselves very good reasons to act the way they do, even if for us, of course, it doesn't make any sense. So in that way, studying National Socialism is a good training for us as citizens. And I would add another reason, which is the existence of negationism. Negationists, as you know, say that the Nazis never committed big crimes, that Auschwitz is a fantasy, and etc., etc. That idea is based upon the fact that, at first sight, what the Nazis did is unthinkable. It's absurd. It's preposterous. It's beyond any representation of the human mind. So if we consider that, of course, it's much easier to negate what they did, because it's impossible to be that mean, that violent, and that criminal. But in fact, it was. It was, because they clearly stated, exposed, and explained what they wanted to do and why they were doing it. So once again, that's important for us historians to consider that, to fight negationism.
Yes, and actually that became very clear, for instance, during the pandemic, because for example, Jair Bolsonaro, our president, his actions had serious consequence not only for Brazilians, because we had thousands and thousands of deaths, but also for the rest of the world, because we became an epicenter of the virus, and we shouldn't have, because we have a very good public health system and we could have vaccines and so on, but the president keeps saying that the vaccines would turn us into alligators, literally. So that's what you said. Unfortunately, it's very true. But moving on to the next question. So in this dance with time, the Third Reich discourse, we spoke a lot about the past and aimed for the future. And another also very important moment for them was the present. And it is no news to us that the Nazis affirmed that Germany was under a very serious attack. That in the moment they spoke, enemies were gathering and forming plans to destroy the strong German nation. And the present was, in this way, a moment of urgency. And of course, untypical times need very untypical measures. And the aim was to protect this precious substance that was the German blood, so that people could rise again as the protagonists of their history. So we would like to ask, the Reich was a long-term project, but what was the role reserved for the present day to the Germans? How should they live and how should they donate themselves to this ongoing cultural revolution so that the project could be indeed successful in the future?
There is a very important word that you use in your question, which is the word urgency. Urgency, which is very common in the Nazi language, of course, not in English, but in German. And in German, you say Not, N-O-T. Not is everywhere. Everywhere is in danger. Everything is in danger for the Nazis in those days. The German people, the German race, the German territory, German history in itself, everything is going to disappear if serious action is not taken. And serious action under the principle of a state of emergency, so to say, Notstand in German. And Notstand, again, is very common in Nazi literature. So you can use in a exceptional way all the time, because times are exceptional. Again, they have that deep conception of history, which goes back to antiquity, but to much further. It's a conception of history that was inherited from biology and paleontology in the 19th century. Gigantic species, titanic species like the dinosaurs have disappeared. We have proof of that everywhere. So of course, civilizations can disappear, like the Greeks and the Romans and us, they say. So we have to take decisive action against that. And there is a balance between the promise of happiness, which is of eschatological nature. There is an eschatological promise, getting out of the valley of death, projecting the race onto a colonial empire without enemies, without history anymore, without time, because there is no adversary and there is no war anymore. A balance between that promise and between the present. The present time is not happy. The Nazis are very clear about that, but they are exalting. They can bring about enthusiasm, and this is the point where they use another word which is important for them, which is the word of generation. Our generation, they say, has a historical duty to fulfill, a historical responsibility, which is to put an end to history by getting rid, one way or another, once again, getting rid of our enemies. And that responsibility is heavy. And this is something that, for instance, Heinrich Himmler, the chief of the SS, stresses upon every time he holds a speech in front of his troops. He says to his troops, be courageous, be decent, be brave. And being brave and being decent means killing children, for instance. This is decent, this is brave. What would not be decent and what would not be brave would be not killing children or innocent people, because those children and those people are not innocent. They are per se, ontologically, biologically, a threat to the race, and they have to be eradicated. So you see how far it goes as far as normativity is concerned, and you see also what is their message to the present day Germans. You are the generation which has been chosen by history or by biology, history and biology being the same, to put an end to history and to put an end to the miseries and to the threats that are endangering the survival of our race. The future generations will thank you for that. And they will only exist if you have been brave enough and decent, anständig enough to fulfill that duty, even if it might seem difficult or unacceptable if you consider the norms that are ruling our actions today. But those norms, you have to bear in mind that those norms are inherited from a past shaped by the Christians, that is to say, by the Jews. So get rid of that. Go back to nature, go back to the beast in you, and let out the beast in you for it to create a safe environment and a safe future for your children and for the race.
Yes, that was very clarifying. And I remembered something that I think I read in The Law of the Blood. I don't know if it was Himmler that said it. That was something like, we have to do it so our kids don't have to do it. Our grandchildren also don't have to do it, because we'll be preparing the ground for them. We'll be building up something new so that they won't have to fight this war, this last ultimate sort of war to conquer this freedom, this Reich that will be peaceful, and as you said, where time will be static as the land. And I thought that was really amazing, this parallel you made, because that's kind of it, right? It's kind of everything comes together and forms this huge thesis. And reading Rosenberg also, it helped me a lot, because I think that he puts himself in this position of kind of guiding people into this destiny. And that really helped me to understand that he saw that not every German was ready for that, but they needed to be. He had to prepare the generation to make the way into this fight. So that really helped me understanding everything around that. So
you're perfectly right. And if I might add something to your comment, the elite of the Nazi regime, Rosenberg, for instance, but Goebbels, Hitler, Himmler, Göring, often considered their fellow citizens are being too weak for what they were up to, not prepared, not up to what they had to do. And eventually Hitler would say to Albert Speer, deep down in the bunker, that the Germans lost the war because they were not strong enough, and they were not as strong as the Russians or as the people from the East. And so the Germans had to disappear according to the laws of nature that the Nazis took so much pride in respecting. They, especially in the text by Goebbels in his journal, you see very often criticisms against the German people of today, which is to deeply emerged into humanitarianism, into sensibility, sensitiveness. They are not ready, but fortunately there is a Führer given by providence, by nature, by biology, and fortunately there is a vanguard, a biological vanguard, which is of course the Nazi Party and the elite of the Nazi Party, among which of course the SS. The last point I wanted to add is that of course the Germans of today are faced with an incredible task, historical and biological task, but they have rewards for that. The elite of the Nazi regime was very very cautious about that. They didn't want the First World War to happen again, and they didn't want the German people to separate itself from the hierarchy, from the power of the state. They didn't want a new revolution to unfold in Germany, like in 1918. So they made many efforts to give the German people things that would keep them happy. Of course, there were symbolical gratifications like the racistic discourse, you are the best race of the world, etc. But there were much more material rewards taken from the spoliation and the predations of the enemies of the regime, and then from the predations all over Europe. The Nazi regime was a regime of gangsters, actually, of robbers. They robbed and they stole everything anywhere they could to give it to themselves. When you look at the collection of works of art of Hitler, of Goering, for instance, and to give it to the German people for it to stay happy and not to launch another revolution like in 1918.
Yes, thank you, Professor. That was really enlightening. Thank you very much for that. And coming back to a point you have already mentioned about the reconstruction of this morals, right, that was necessary in order to common people, to perpetrate such terrible actions, right? From a historical perspective, the Third Reich seems to have used and abused of a few specific moments in the past. The rise of Christianity as a major power, the French Revolution, and the Great War, with all of the supposed shameful legacy for the Germans, are some of them. And in the background of these moments is the rise of ideas such as equality and democracy. So in a larger perspective, these ideas bring moral values that were condemned by the regime that had the harsh and huge task to, along with history, refund and the values that constricted Occidental morals. So which aspects of these morals and of course of cultural revolutions do you explore in your book? Which areas had to be destroyed and rebuilt to give the Reich the possibility of exterminating its enemies and protecting himself, of course?
Thank you for your question. You understood perfectly that for them to be able to drive German people to violent and lethal actions, they had to reread and reconstruct the whole history of normativity, the whole spectrum of norms that were ruling the actions of the German people. in Germany in the 1930s, many, some heritages, some sets of values were available, values derived from Christianity and values derived from the French Revolution. On the one hand, the values of love and empathy and universalism, and on the other hand, universalism again, plus liberty, equality, and fraternity. Those ideas were, in their eyes, in the eyes of the Nazis, preposterous. And they were not the only ones to say that. And still today, of course, you have a vast population and of politicians everywhere in the world who fight against those values because they embrace another conception of mankind, which is particularistic again, which is social Darwinist, and which is racist. And that was clearly the set of values of the Nazis. And again, they were not very original in defending them because they were heirs to previous traditions of the 19th century, where political theories were built against the heritage of the French Revolution. In the eyes of the Nazis, the whole history of the culture of the Germanic race was the history of acculturation to something alien, to something strange. And that acculturation, of course, was a denaturation. That is to say, a process in which you were taken from your own origin, your own nature, to become something else that you were not supposed to be. To sum it up briefly, the original blonde beast of the Germanic tribes had been evangelized by Christian pilgrims, Christian clerks in the Middle Ages, and that Christianization of the Germanic tribes was a denaturation of their very own nature, because they were warriors, they were supposed to be warriors, they were polygamists, they were etc., etc. So this is at least what the Nazis said and what the historians of the 19th century had said before. So Christianity deprived the Germanic tribes of their own identity. They made them weak. They weakened them because, of course, when you're a Christian, you cannot fight like you used to be when you were worshipping brutal gods who needed blood and victims of sacrifice, and not a poor god that was that died in a cross and that was a man victim of men. So that's the first heritage that should be eradicated, because in the eyes of the Nazis, Christianity was in fact Judeo-Christianity. It was a plot by the Jews to weaken the Germans. St. Paul, who was the creator of Christianity after Christ, St. Paul was a Jew, as was Christ, by the way. So it's obvious for them that it is a plot by the Jews, a very mean plot, to disarm, to weaken, and to defeat the Germanic race. The second heritage, which is, of course, to be eradicated as well, is the heritage of the French Revolution. Again, the conception on the French Revolution is of biological nature. Christianity had been invented by Jews who had been defeated by the Roman Empire as a plot against the Roman Empire and against the Germans. So it was of biological nature. And again, in the 18th century, the French Revolution was the plot and the actions of the least acknowledged member of the French society, of the retarded, of the weak, of the poor, against the French aristocracy, which was of German descent, of course, blue blood, etc., etc., different blood, different race. And it was an insurrection of the weak, of the poor, of the sick, of the retarded, against the good, against the elite, against the aristocracy. This is a biological view on the French Revolution that also explains all the revolution of the 19th century till the 20th century, of course, the Soviet Revolution in Russia in 1917. So everything comes back to a biological origin and has to be dealt with in a biological, medical way. This is very clear for the Nazis, and it gives a very clear direction to what is to be done.
Thank you. Oh my God, I kind of lost myself here thinking about it. I'm sorry. But yes, this is so specific and crazy. But yes, I'm glad to hear they've shared some of those views. I think that thinking the Russian Revolution as a consequence of the French Revolution makes a lot of sense in their perspective, right? Because it's like a radicalization of all of these principles that were applied in the French Revolution. So thank you very much, Professor. So now a sort of self-interested question, also out of curiosity, but also because I think that there are relevant things that we must consider about it. So in this rewriting of history and in this building of this new regime, what was the role reserved for historians in the Nazi regime, and how should they contribute to building the new Reich and the new future, since history was also a way to plan this future and to avoid those mistakes that brought all these amazing civilizations into this spiral of destruction. And so please.
Yeah, thank you again for the question. It's very puzzling, actually, when you look at books published in the 1930s and when you see people like you and me with PhDs, being professors and writing abject things about race and about the racial history of Greece or of Rome, etc. In fact, for the Nazis, it was very clear that the historians, as well as all the other scientists, should be the soldiers of the new era, period. Every good German, every sound-minded German could understand that National Socialism was a right way of thinking, of seeing the world, and of acting, period. And of course, that was all the more the fact for scientists. They were the most intelligent, so they had to be the fiercest Nazis. Everything, as far as science is concerned, was understood under the name of Dienst am Volk, the service you had to do to the people. You had to serve like a soldier. Not in the trenches, not on the Eastern Front, but on the front of science. You had to fight the enemies, and you had to produce good science to convince your fellow citizens that everything was right, of course, about National Socialism and about that biological view of history. The vast majority of historians, of course, bought that, and they became what the Nazis wanted them to become, for many reasons. First, because they themselves had a particularistic view on history and on culture, because also they were coming from very privileged backgrounds, because the going to school and going to universities was reserved to a very small minority of the population. And coming from those backgrounds, they had very conservative views on society, very nationalistic views on the nation and on Germany. And they were, of course, prone to understand what the Nazis were saying. And there is another reason, which is the sudden liberation of so many jobs in April 1933. April the 7th, 1933, there was the law for the recreation of the German public service. And that law had the consequence of firing 1/3 of the professors and researchers in universities, in German universities. So there were jobs to be taken, provided you gave some sign of your goodwill and your understanding of the necessities of the day.
Thank you, Professor.
Can I just
now,
make like
yes.
a very quick comment? I'm sorry. It's just that I'm listening to you say, I just wanted to highlight how we can see the regime functioning in a sense that everything serves the race, right? I think that listening to you talk about historians, and I've read some other people, but I think you bring it on in a clarity that is really amazing, that they had to serve this purpose. And since history was a very important foundation, right? They had a really important role in it. And I reminded myself of the law also. I think that it is a something that you talk a lot about in your books, and it is really interesting to see. I think that the law is a great example because we see jurists all serving on this purpose, and they rebuilt on law, obviously. I think they like common law a lot more, but certainly they didn't follow it quite literally. But you quote Roland Freisler on your book, and he says that the law must be as quick as he must be like the sort of armored battalions, right? And they have to be quick, they have to function well. And I think that we can think historians sort of in the same way, right? I think that they had to be quick and respond to this demand to inform society about this past. So we just wanted to highlight that, because I think it really helps us to understand how everything kind of worked towards this idea and towards the protection of this German blood that was in danger. And well, it's just this comment. I think that it is an aspect that always caught my attention a lot.
You're perfectly right. Everything is understood by the Nazis under the two points of view of biology and of war. They are social Darwinists in the very plain sense of the word, and they consider that life is a war, life is a struggle, and that in the particular period where Germany is in the 1930s, it's urgent and it's necessary to act quickly and violently. And so everyone in Germany has to be a soldier of the race. The women have to bear children in good health and in good shape, and many children, so they have to be soldiers of the race in that sense. The scientists, the historians, the jurists, everybody has to tend towards that goal, that the race should be freed from the threats and the danger it had to endure till the present time.
Thank you, Professor. So I would like to ask a question that we touched upon a little bit, but I think we could, in the sense of finishing up the interview, I think it's important. So you mentioned, of course, you touched a lot about this here today, that Nazi discourse was convincing, but also was coherent in its incoherence. And the logic behind the ideas worked very well for the Germans. But unfortunately, we see that the extreme right, the far right, are gaining strength in every corner of the world. As we mentioned, Brazil is no different, unfortunately. So in the sense, history is yet again a critical discourse to legitimize and to bring attention to these right-wing parties and movements. So we'd like to ask, which arguments do you perceive similar to those from the 30s and then 40s, and how can the understanding of this past can help us fight these new threats to democracy and fundamental rights, and things that you touched upon a little bit, but I think we can talk a little bit more.
Yes, thank you for that question, which brings us to today and to how useful we can be to our fellow citizens and to our present days. The first lesson we can draw from the history of the 1930s and 1940s that those people had good reasons to act, and that we have to understand them to better fight them. We have to understand their Weltanschauung, their vision of the world. We have to understand the pillars upon which rest their vision of the world and their actions. That is one thing. The other thing is that we can also draw some lessons from the mistakes that were made by the democracies in the 1930s, as far as austerity, for instance, is concerned, as far as the governing of economics is concerned. But also, I think we shouldn't insist that much on the 1930s, 1940s, because one big difference between those days and today is that in the 1930s, people were just recovering from the First World War and had been accustomed to violence, extreme violence. And I speak here only of Europe, because the Brazilian case is different. In Brazil, there was no First World War, there was no massive habituation to mass violence, and there is today a massive violence in Brazilian society. As far as I remember, 30,000 people a year die of violent death by weapons in Brazil. So what I'm saying here is more relevant for Europe, actually, where maybe the good period of comparison wouldn't be in the 1930s, but the end of the 19th century, where there was a huge process of globalization that brought about many disarrays and many miseries in Europe, and many political upheavals as well. And that period also was marked by the first big insurrections against the Republic in France, against that vision of the world that had been inherited from the Enlightenment. And for the first time at the end of the 19th century, facing the problems of the day, of globalization, of economic recession, of economic crisis, of immigration as well, there were people who, for the first time, created a national socialist doctrine in the literal sense of the word, and they used that expression as well. National socialist. They wanted to be social in that they would give more justice and more goods to the good old white people, but that kind of socialism, which was not socialism at all, would be exerted in a national context, not in an internationalist one. So the end of the 19th century is worth studying as far as Europe is concerned. Again,
Thank you. I think I never thought about this in this aspect, that we should go even further, but it makes a lot of sense. So getting to the end of the interview, we want to ask you a more specific question. So could you please talk a little bit more about your book, The Nazi Cultural Revolution? Of course, it's the reason we started the interview, for example. one thing that struck my attention was the title. When one thinks of revolution, we usually think of left-oriented ones, for example, the French Revolution, which we talked, the Russian Revolution, and the revolutions of the end of this Soviet century, to mention the term of Moshlowy. These are some examples. So in this sense, why should we also consider the Nazi ideology a revolution? And of course, in the second point, what should the Brazilian audience expect of this book that you wrote in broader terms? If you could talk a little bit more.
Thank you again for that question. That new book, the Nazi Cultural Revolution, is trying to wrap up all the themes that I studied and discussed in the previous books, National Socialism and Antiquity, so in English, Greeks, Romans, Germans, and the Law of Blood. It tries to come back to specific points of interest as far as the rewriting of time and of history on the one hand, and the conception of the norm on the other hand are concerned. And again, this is something I quickly explained a bit earlier. When you hear the word revolution, of course, you think of our understanding of the word today, which is a bright opening into a new future, some sort of a new time. For the Nazis, it was something real different. It was rivolvere in the ancient pre-revolutionary sense of the word. It was coming back to the origin. I could say that the Nazis were so fiercely against the French Revolution that they used the word revolution, and they used it very frequently. They used the word revolution in the sense that prevailed before the French Revolution. So much they hated the French Revolution, and they used that word revolution, nationale Revolution, for instance, national revolution, because they knew that that word was very powerful, was very motivating, was very useful in making people enthusiastic about acting politically. So they used that, and we saw that throughout the 20th century. Revolution was used by people who could rightly use that word, of course, coming from the internationalist movement and from the left. And it was used, and it's still used today, by right-wing extremists who only keep the strength, the symbolic strength of that word, and maybe, like the Nazis, who think of coming back to the past in a revolutio, in the Latin sense of the word, in a return to the origin.
Yeah, I think it's just amazing. I have never thought about it, but listening to you explain, of course, it makes all the sense that they use revolution in a previous concept other than the French Revolution. And I don't know if I'm being repetitive, but I just thought that this was really amazing insight. But it's crazy because they want to come back into a point in time that is previous to history itself, in a sense, right? Because if history is, as you said, this valley of death for the Romans, and they are trying to go back into this peaceful time, it is as previous as history itself. I don't know if this makes sense or I'm going too far. I wanted to listen a bit. You talk about it. What do you think?
No, you are perfectly right. You're perfectly right. It's they want to eradicate history. Actually, again, they have a deep anxiety against history and against time and against time going by. because again, this is a process of the degeneration of the body and of the race. So you have to get out of this mess, and to get out of this mess, either you become, you develop a faith into a transcendency, like the Christian God, but that's not relevant in their eyes, or you work here and now on the ground of this planet to project your race into eternity. And eternity has nothing to do with time nor history. There is no history, there is no time anymore. So again, hence this conception of the stasis you mentioned earlier. It's a stasis. It's a place which is very plain, where nothing moves, because there is no enemy anymore. There is no event, and the Germanic race, at long last, is able to give birth to children, to breed children, to feed children for the centuries and the millenaries to come, without hindrance. And that's the goal. That's the ultimate goal.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Professor. So to finish, of course, we are very far from contemplating all of your theory and all of your books themes, which are very, very important. And we said a lot of times we're big fans. So we would just like to ask if there's anything you want to say to our Brazilian audience, if you have any messages or any advice or anything you want to say to finish the interview.
Well, thank you for asking. Actually, I had the chance some 10 years ago to live a little bit in your country, in Brazil. I was an invited professor in Brasilia, and I had some time to travel through your amazingly beautiful and fantastic country. It was 10 years ago, so it was under Dilma and under another political power. And I must say that I deeply feel for you, and I have deeply felt for you those past years. And I suffer very much from the stupidity, the aggressivity, and the meanness of the people who are in charge right now. They are corrupt. They are wrong in every aspect. They are extremely dangerous for you, for the life in Brazil, for the nature in Brazil, and for the world. And I really hope, really hope that in the next week you will get rid of that thing that is torturing your country, like your American neighbors up north did with the other Bolsonaro of the north. So again, fingers crossed.
Yeah, we hope so too. We truly hope so too. And perhaps sometime, someday you can come back and visit us in a better moment, right? We would love to actually have the chance to meet you, and let's hope that we can change this situation before you come and teach us a little bit more about these moments in history that has so much to say to us, unfortunately, until the present day. So thank you a lot, Professor.
No, thank you, because when I listen to you, I realize all the more that you deserve much more and much better than what you have right now. So thank you very much for your very warm intelligence and for